Why, hello there, old sports. Over the years, various people in the Five Nights at Freddy's fandom have brought up the idea of a FNaF game that takes place at Fredbear's family diner. Going back to the very beginning of where everything first went wrong is an appealing idea to many, and I completely understand why. Additionally, considering how much recent focus the series has given to the earliest days of the franchise with Secret of the Mimic, lots of people think now would be the perfect time to finally pull the trigger and make the long-awaited Fredbear's Family Diner game the fans have been pleading for, and to become the first game in the series to make over $1 Fazillion. But here comes the problem. What would the game actually be about? Whenever I hear someone bring up a Fredbear's Family Diner game, they rarely ever bring up what we would actually see happen in said game, beyond the simple premise of the game taking place at the diner near the beginning of the timeline. The rare few who actually go into detail seem to either forget various timeline events or details, which to be fair isn't really their fault, the timeline is a mess, or they just blatantly ignore the problems this hypothetical game would inherently have. Now, before moving forwards, I'd just like to state that there's nothing wrong with wanting a Fredbear's Family Diner game, and you are not a bad or stupid person for wanting that. I personally just think people get too excited at the idea of a Fredbear game, and don't realize the issues that would come with making a game that would be at that point in the timeline, or that location. But I'm sure you'd actually like to know what some of those issues are, so let's get to it. Now originally, I was going to split my thoughts about the issues I have with this concept into different sections, but ultimately, I realized that most of my problems tie into each other, so I feel like attempting to break these issues up for the sake of formatting would feel awkward. Anyways, I decided to start this general discussion with one question, and I already asked it earlier. What would the game actually be about? Now, obviously, the general premise of any Five Nights at Freddy's game is to survive against haunted animatronics for 5 nights. Ignoring the fact that none of the games actually only have 5 nights, but whatever. So, trying to simplify that idea down to fit with the direction the new games are going in, your goal in any FNaF game is to survive in a building against violent animatronics. But it doesn't take much thinking to realize why this would be hard to justify for a Fredbear's Family Diner game, especially one that takes place near the beginning of the timeline. If the game takes place while Fredbear's is in its prime, there'd be no game, because no one has died yet, and thus none of the mascots are haunted. Now, Secret of the Mimic sidestepped this issue in 2 ways. First of all, the main threat of the game is the titular Mimic, who, while paranormal, probably isn't haunted by any specific soul. The extremely advanced machine was imbued with negative emotions by its creator, which allows it to act unusually, and more importantly for the sake of the game, violently. The second thing I'd like to bring up is that the ghost activity that is present is a degree of separation removed from the main Afton and Freddy's plot. While you can argue if William killed David or not, it's not really important who killed him, but more that he died at all and caused Edwin to go off the deep end. Not that he wasn't already off the deep end, the guy was sleeping with a robot, but that's irrelevant for this. Ultimately, my point here is that Secret of the Mimic introduces us to new or unexplained elements of the series that are a little more distant from the story we already know. So when you want to retread old ground like the diner, you're going to have to be careful not to make the already messy timeline even more complicated and awkward. Now, I will admit, there are some ideas for a plot that I've seen that work much better than others. One of these ideas is that the game could take place after William takes Charlie's life, and that gives us a reason as to why the animatronics could be haunted, and thus out for blood. Because I'm gonna be honest, I feel like a lot of people forget that if the animatronics aren't going under like some sort of possession or haunted sort of deal, they shouldn't really be able to hurt people, let alone kill them. The Mimic is a glaring exception to this, but that thing is already kind of an anomaly in terms of the other animatronics in this series. So, I feel like using it as a baseline is already kind of a flawed way of thinking. Anyways, as seen in the second FNaF movie, there is a precedent set for the idea that the puppet can control or influence other mascots, because if the puppet is the only one who is dead, or Charlie is the only one who is dead, that gives us a reason as to why the other mascots are moving around with the intent to kill. However, this leads us to our next problem, the gameplay. Because even if you can come up with a lore reason to justify this game's existence, we still need gameplay for this Five Nights at Freddy's game. While it's not clear if Fredbear's Family Diner actually had the marionette as a character, or if that was just a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza thing, the puppet is the only additional addition to the Fredbear's cast of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie that we know of. So that means, at most, there's only 3 characters that could be used for this potential Fredbear's game. Every Sit and Survive FNaF game has at least 4 characters to deal with, and that even includes FNaF 3, which only has 1 fatal threat. And even on the rare occasion where you only have 1 character after you, that 1 character is tweaked to be hyper-aggressive to cause a 1v1 scenario. And I could be wrong, but I doubt that 2 hyper-aggressive characters could be balanced well without the game feeling too hard or too easy. But then again, that's just my opinion, and I am no means the end-all be-all of FNaF discussion. So you might be thinking, if there's issues with the traditional Sit and Survive Five Nights at Freddy's game, why not make a game like Security Breach or Secret of the Mimic, where you're free roaming around the diner? You could even argue that having a smaller location compared to the Pizzaplex could solve the problem of feeling like the animatronics aren't covering enough ground, because in Security Breach it felt like the size of the building made it difficult for the 4 animatronics that were there to actually be a threat, hence why all the staff bots were littered around. But there lies the problem. Fredbear's Family Diner isn't the size of a mall like the Mega Pizzaplex. It also isn't a manor that doubles as a museum to show off inventions. The diner is just that, a small diner. I worry that if a free roam game was made in the diner, it would get stale very quickly because there would only be a handful of rooms at most, and even that is being generous, because as seen in the minigames, the diner only has about like 2 small rooms. Though that may just be something done for the sake of the minigame, so please keep that in mind. For a smaller location like the diner, a traditional Sit and Survive game would probably fit better, because you're stuck in one room and waiting for the threats to come to you, so the only relevant room is that office. But not only are there issues with that like I mentioned previously, but the FNaF series in general has been seeming like it wants to move away from that style of game for better or worse. So I don't see them making another game in that style for a bit, especially after Steel Wolf finally found their stride with Free Roam and Secret of the Mimic. But again, I'm just a random nobody online. There's always the chance that I'm wrong. I think the biggest problem I have with the idea of a Fredbear's game is that with our current understanding of the story, Fredbear's is less of a real place in the context of the plot, but more of a source from which everything that happens springs forth from. Pretty much everything important that we know happens at Fredbear's is covered in FNaF 4 through the intermission minigames. So honestly, beyond the novel of a Fredbear's game just existing for the sake of it, I don't think there's even really a reason we need to go back to Fredbear's for a game. Maybe Fredbear's could cameo as a location in a game for some other reason, but I feel like there's not very many good ways the game could fit into the story, nor interesting gameplay ideas to be explored. But of course, there's one exception to all this. One thing that might just give this game a chance at life. And that's the FNaF community's favorite thing. Now, FNaF fans have issues with retcons for many reasons, including a years-old post from Scott mentioning how he's only ever done one retcon that people still use as a gotcha for theories today for some reason, as well as the fact that the idea of a retcon varies from person to person. Now, to be extremely literal, the meaning of retcon is retroactive continuity, and to be honest, taking that meaning to the extreme, anything after the first game is technically a retcon, because when Scott made the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, FNaF was going to be a standalone title. Most of the elements we associate with the series wouldn't even exist without retcons. We wouldn't even have a reason to think there were any other locations but the one we play the first game in. Now, my point I'm trying to get at here is that retcons aren't inherently bad like some people in the community seem to think they are. One example of a recent retcon that I really like is the backstory given to Chica in Secret of the Mimic. It gives the character a little more depth, and makes her feel more special, as well as finally giving a satisfying meaning behind the infamous "I have seen everything" line. Now, I will admit, I'm not sure what the general consensus is on the new Chica lore, but I really liked it, like I said. I think something similar could be done to flesh out Fredbear's Family Diner. You could have earlier versions of characters that exist later in the timeline, similar to how Music Man was retroactively given the ancestor of Big Top in Secret of the Mimic. If the fans allowed themselves to be open to changing and fleshing out the past, like what happened with Secret of the Mimic, I feel like a Fredbear's game could work. But that's the thing. The series tends to treat Fredbear and its characters with an air of mystery, and if you made the game in Fredbear's, you'd have to finally give proper designs to those characters without hiding them behind the darkness, or dozens of alternate designs. Now, I feel like the problem with this is after keeping these things so vague and nebulous for so long, changing the little we do know and solidifying things a certain way would end up making lots of people angry, because ultimately, everyone would be wanting different things. I feel like a lot of people have built up the idea in their own head of the Fredbear's game, and it's something that really can't be real beyond fantasy. I think the reason there's so many Fredbear's fan games that have been received so positively is because of different expectations a fan game has compared to a mainline title. Any changes to the lore or story are fine, because it's a fan game. If the game is different from what you want, it doesn't matter, because it's not like it's the official Fredbear's game. But of course, those excuses wouldn't work if Scott or Steelwool made a Fredbear's game for obvious reasons. So again, I feel like the only real way you could make a Fredbear's Family Diner game and have it work is if you retconned a lot of stuff, or shifted things around, or just made a completely spin-off thing where it's in its own universe or something. I don't know. I guess I just feel like there's plenty of ways that Fredbear's game wouldn't work, and I feel like it's one of those things that sounds cool on the surface, but has plenty of logistical problems that you'd have to get around if you actually wanted to make it a reality. And I don't know if Steelwool and Scott want to try to do that, especially when there's plenty of people wanting to see where the story goes next. Now, overall, like I said at the beginning of the video, there's nothing wrong with wanting a Fredbear's Family Diner game, and I don't see you as any less of a good or bad person for that alone. I just think that there's logistical issues that would have to be dealt with before you'd make a Fredbear's game, and considering how complicated some parts of the timeline already are, I feel like that would just be needlessly confusing for something that doesn't even really need to exist. Like I said, pretty much everything that needs to be covered about Fredbear's is covered in FNaF 4. And again, maybe I'm just not really invested enough in the idea of a Fredbear's game, and I'm missing some ideas that would actually make the game very fun or interesting. And I'm sure if Scott and Steelwool really wanted, they could find a way to make it work. But those are just my thoughts. What are yours? Would you like a Fredbear's Family Diner game? Do you think it'd be a good idea? Comment down below your thoughts, I'd love to read them. And while you're down there, maybe consider hitting the like button or the subscribe button for more videos like this, because I'm thinking about making some more video essays again. I know it's been a while since I've made one, but I just felt like making one, so here I am. And of course, regardless, I would like to thank you for your time here today. It makes my day that people want to watch my videos, even if it's only a couple hundred, because that's still a really big number. The internet has fried my conception of how big numbers are. And of course, I'd like to thank my 3 YouTube channel members, Wally73, Sven Biscuit, and Amara98 for their continued financial support. It means the world to me. Anyways, with all that being said, I think I've said all I need to say, so have a good day, have a good night, whatever time it is for you, and see you on the flip side.